What if I told you that one of the greatest civilizing forces in world history wasn't an empire or a war, but our dinner? Welcome to History Secrets Uncovered. My name is Jay Chandarana, and today I have the honor of speaking with Professor Paul Freedman of Yale University, who's one of the world's leading historians of medieval Europe and the history of food. Today we'll explore why food has been one of history's greatest driving forces, how it transformed civilizations, and what our meals can tell us about the past. Professor Freedman, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Jay.
Before becoming a historian, what first sparked your interest in medieval history, and when did food suddenly become something that you really realized could explain history itself?
I became interested in the Middle Ages because the justifications that people use for religious piety and warfare, how they reconcile those two, fascinated me. As it turns out, I never did any work on research published on the Crusades, which is the kind of thing that motivated me in the first place. But it's the puzzling coexistence of piety and military aggression that first interested me as a high school student. The interest in food as something worth academic research is relatively late in my career. So I was interested always in status and how people define their class position using external signs, things
Yeah.
like what kind of car you drive or where you take your vacations, what kind of sneakers you have, but also very much what kind of food you eat. And this is true for the Middle Ages, stereotypes about peasants and aristocrats. And so I did a book about spices and the demand for spices because these were the mark of prestigious dining and required if you were of the upper classes. You had to have dishes that were, by modern European standards, incredibly spicy and full of aromatic flavor. Why is that? And what does that do for people? And then the impact of even frivolous deciding that you want spice with your meals, but the spice doesn't grow anywhere near you. What are the consequences of that?
Yeah, and I think when people think about world history in general, we usually imagine wars, revolutions, and political leaders as being the most important driving forces. Now, what do you think most people misunderstand about the role food has in shaping civilizations?
I guess the degree to which food is involved in the cause and conduct of those wars. So, most obviously, many wars involve starving your enemies or inflict famine or food shortages, but often, as with colonial wars between Britain and France, for example, or between Britain and Spain, the war is over commodities, sometimes things like gold and silver, but often over things like sugar or spices or later on rubber. So I was particularly interested in the way in which food determines some of those political rivalries.
And
Beyond that, food is a cultural marker and give rise to a tremendous amount of both pride, identity, as well as hostility. And I'm interested in how that works itself out, often in unexpected ways historically.
and I think that pride is very interesting because in one of your works, Out of the East, you talk about how something as simple as spices could influence exploration, trade, even politics, as you're talking about these wars between England and Spain, France and Britain, all these places. Why were spices so valuable that people were willing to cross oceans and even risk their lives to obtain them?
That's right. So I would say that spices are simple in the sense that we all know what they are, but even more than that, they would seem frivolous. In other words, we can understand why people go to war or invest in huge engineering projects for strategically important products like petroleum, most obviously, or foods that are necessities like wheat or corn. But that they will go to great measures to obtain products that are not necessary for human survival. After all, sugar, even more than spices, is such a commodity. And yet the Roman Empire didn't have sugar. They sort of depended on honey for sweets. So really, and that gets back to the misconceptions question, people just assume that important products drive history, when in fact, often it's things that are delightful or experienced as delicious, but are luxuries. And so, not just wars, but the very colonization, much of the rest of the world by Europe, is dependent. And in Henry Hobhouse, a historian of exchanges between America and the Old World, remarked that the European arrival in the New World didn't really owe very much to religion, but it had a lot to do with pepper.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Or they're not incompatible. One of Vasco da Gama's sailors, at the time that da Gama first rounded the Cape of Good Hope and arrived from Portugal to India, was accosted by a Muslim trader from Tunis who basically asked him, "What ill wind brought you guys here?" Because obviously these are not only religious rivals, but economic rivals.
Yeah,
And the sailor responded, "We came for Christians and spices."
that's interesting. I think that today we talk a lot about identity and how different cultures use food to portray their identity. Why do you think something so universal as food became such a powerful way for societies to define and even distinguish themselves between one another?
Precisely because it's so universal, and not only universal, but every day. One of the reasons why these questions that you're asking are important and come up is basically, well, why is food important when it seems to be something that is so routine, universal, ordinary? Or are you going to be a historian of sleep, for example? Sure, it's a necessity, and sure, it's worth studying famines and other crises with regard to food. But the notion that food is part of identity and that identities clash. On the one hand, for example, in the United States, the food of immigrants has been very highly valued. There have been Italian restaurants, Chinese restaurants, 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that immigrants themselves are well treated. I was interested in sort of how is it that you could have an exponential rise in the number of Chinese restaurants occurring at the same time as legislation to restrict the immigration of Chinese out of competition with the labor market.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like most Americans don't think about food in that way. And without using food to tell that story, you wouldn't see that correlation or be asking those types of questions as well.
I think that's right.
Do you think that the history of food tells a different story about globalization than what we're normally taught in schools? And if so, what is that story?
Well, for one thing, the schools tend to teach as a new phenomenon. One of the misconceptions would be a degree to which globalization is supposedly new, when in fact it's quite old, as witness the exchanges of things like the world product that becomes popular in Italy, or
Sure.
a world product that becomes cultivated in the Caribbean and in Brazil. But I'm not sure if schools teach it this way, but globalization is a sense of offering people more choices, but it's also consequences. New World slavery, for example, was developed to supply, in the first place, a labor force to cultivate sugar.
Mm.
Or in our time, produce item in a supermarket comes from over 1,000 miles away.
Yeah.
Perfectly possible, say, to grow asparagus in the United States. Almost all comes from Peru and Mexico. From the point of view of economics, from the point of view of environmental consequences, it's disastrous.
Yeah. And also on in terms of globalization, but it could be interpreted in other ways as well. When we look at today's conversations about food in culture, are there moments that make you think this is something new in conversation? Or are all of these debates that we have about food, where it's sourced, decisions we've been having for centuries, just maybe tweaked slightly?
Oh, I think there's a lot of new things. Just the fact that food is not just serious in terms of what I was mentioning before, famine or nutrition, but choices that people make, cuisine. The case that many historians, frivolous or unimportant topic. Just an example, I gave a paper at a meeting of medievalists about cook written in the Catalan language
Oh,
in the
cool.
late Middle Ages. And one of my friends, a colleague at another university, um, then asked, well, whatever happened to the Paul Freedman who wrote The Origins of Peasant Servitude in Medieval Catalonia? And the meaning of that is, what happened to you? You were a serious person. You worked on peasant servitude and now cookbooks. I thought reasonably in circumstances, having devoted 25 years to the study of peasants, I thought I'd spend the rest of my career researching rich people. That's not exactly the motivation,
No,
but
yes, of
the
course.
asking the question, like, food history, are you serious? Shows, I say to students, I have one course that and I would say to them, I'm here, and I know you take this seriously, but I'd be interested to know what your parents think. And they laugh, their parent, I sent you to Yale in order for you to take a course on the history of food. Are you kidding?
Yeah, I know what you mean by that, but I think throughout this conversation, you could see that it is a very important conversation to have, even though on the surface, looking at it from the outside, you might not see those connections and that importance.
Well, good. I'm glad you say that.
Yeah. And your research does span medieval Europe, trade, culture, and food history. After spending decades studying these topics and their connections amongst one another, has your own relationship with food changed, or how you think about it?
Yes, so although not all that much, having started this when as an interest when I was well over 40. Um, and I always was interested in food as a kind of aesthetic experience, or kids collect or
Sure.
be interested in this engines, thing. So I used to read Gourmet magazine my mother subscribed to, even though I didn't know how to cook,
Yeah.
uh, or was aware of Michelin starred restaurants in France when Michelin restaurants in Europe. But um, I more focused on the social meaning of food, not always the profound social meaning in terms of identity, but phenomena like why New York uh, people always complain about how noisy restaurants are. Noisy when a lot of their customers or potential customers are elderly people who both because they might have hearing problems and also just because of their, need, they were more quiet. And, has to do with the sociology of restaurant customers.
Yeah.
Most people in a restaurant are young, and most people who go to restaurants more than, say, once a month are, 30s. And for them, if there's no noise, there's no buzz. And if there's no buzz, the restaurant looks like it's going to be a failure.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, the equation that the restaurant, be it the chef, the owner, the staff, what they're doing and why they're doing it, than I would have been as a regular restaurant customer in the past.
That's really interesting. And I think something else that's been in my mind is that throughout our high school career learning history, we learn a very broad period of time. And it's very difficult to get into nuances of things during that. For a year, I took United States history, US history. And it's about 1600 to 2000. That's 400 years to cover in 8 months. So we take school by learning through political events. But food is really interesting because it sits at an intersection of economics, religion, science, culture, maybe even more things all at once. What does studying food reveal about history that we can't just understand simply by looking at things like political events?
Well, I think it in the shows class, regional, gender differences. What time was it decided that women like salads and men like steak? Or uh, the earlier, well, why is it that Americans loved the food of immigrants and that not shared until very recently by European countries? Why associated racial difference and how it evolved? So,
Yeah.
as you said before, it touches on a lot of phenomena. The kinds that most interest me are cultural. In other words, again, not just what people eat because either it's inexpensive or it's what they're, eat when they have some choice and why they make those choices.
It's really
Why do
interesting.
some people who live near the sea or the ocean actually not eat very much fish? Britain for fish, but there are only like three species, and they're cod. They're not actually big fish eaters.
Yeah.
Um, uh, Historically similar. They've got incredible amount of coastline, and yet the things that they like to eat are seafood. Okay, observed regulations and to eat a lot of seafood, but it was.
I think that's really interesting. It gets us a really unique view into the culture people have when they have choice. I think that's really,
And that
really cool.
culture is sometimes more important than environment.
Yeah, sure. Because people act with that choice as opposed to what you mean with environment, as in how you're raised to act and do certain things and
Yeah,
eat, for example, as well.
exactly.
And after studying both medieval history and the history of food, what's one lesson that you hope people can take away, not just about what we eat, but about the way that history shapes our daily lives today?
That history is more kind of accidental, adding to another, and that it's full of unintended consequences. So a lot of things are presented as if they were inevitable, like European expansion to the rest of the world. Uh, and inevitable. They're not completely accidental in the sense that there are reasons for it, but the reasons are affected by factors that are not really structurally built. Similarly, the in fact liked to put sugar in tea, whereas the Chinese who developed it do not. The Europeans chocolate, whereas the Mexican do not, or sugar in coffee. These are all choices, frivolous choices,
Yeah.
aesthetic choices, and yet they are behind, one of the clismic trends in world history, the development of slavery, New World sugar cultivation, and the exponential rise in the demand for sugar.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I think that's an awesome note to end off on.
Good, good. Well, pleasure talking with you.